Like most politicians, the media didn't ignore the liberation of Palmyra, calling it a key battlefield and psychological victory in the fight against terror. For more, let's cross live now to Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First. Mr. Papadopoulos, thank you so much for joining us on the programme this evening. Now, it seems like the media have been a lot more vocal with the story than politicians. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that's relative. Yes, there are some newspapers, for example, in Britain, who are questioning as to why the British government has not rejoiced in the recapture of Palmyra by the Syrian army. But of course, it's relative. There is still an overwhelming silence in Britain, as there is an overwhelming silence in America on what was a magnificent victory of the Syrian army, not just a victory for Syria, not just a defeat for terrorism, but a victory for civilization. But for the last 2 years, America and Britain have projected themselves as fighting ISIS. Well, like anything else in politics, nothing is ever what it seems. In 2013, when ISIS emerged in Syria, no one in Britain and in America had heard of ISIS. No British politician or American politician was condemning ISIS. Why? Because Washington and London were quite content to see ISIS capture territory from the Syrian army and threaten the survival of the Syrian government and the Syrian state. And of course, Washington and London gave the green light to their allies in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, to start arming and training ISIS. It was only in 2014, when ISIS re-emerged in Iraq, that the alarm bells were ringing in Washington and London. And then everyone in Britain and America heard about ISIS and heard about how America and Britain were going to deal with them. But prior to that, they were quite happy for them to pose a threat to the Syrian army. But the Americans have been bombing ISIS in Syria since the fall of 2014. But it's been an abject failure. So we really have to question, who have the Americans been bombing in Syria? Because it's only the Russian military campaign, of course coordinated with the Syrian army on the ground, which is defeating ISIS, which is enabling the Syrian soldiers, the Syrian forces, to recapture Syrian territory. So America and Britain has a very ambiguous stance towards ISIS, and we must always remember that Washington and London have a long history of working with Islamist terrorists. They did it in Afghanistan in the 1980s, they did it in Bosnia against the Bosnian Serbs, they did it in Libya against Colonel Gaddafi, and they have been doing it since the beginning of 2012 in Syria.
Mr. Papadopoulos, with the recapture of Palmyra, do you think the tide has turned in the way Syrian ground forces will be viewed by the international community?
I think it's a significant victory. I think it's another decisive turning point. I think now it allows the Syrian army to capture all the desert land which stands between Palmyra and the border of Iraq, and of course south with the border with Jordan. So I do think it's a very significant victory. However, I would say that there have been other significant victories preceding the Palmyra victory. For example, in the north, the Syrian army has been liberating land along the Turkish border. And by liberating land along the Turkish border, it is preventing Islamists and jihadists from crossing into Syria, because, of course, Turkey is one big training camp for Islamist terrorists. So yes, Palmyra is a significant victory. It opens up the way to the Iraqi border and to the Jordanian border, and it's a great morale boost for the Syrian army as well. And ISIS is in a lot of trouble because, of course, they're now in desert land in eastern Syria, and it's very difficult to defend yourselves from air attacks, from ground forces in the desert. So I think we should expect a lot of territory in eastern Syria to be liberated by the gallant Syrian army. And for people watching this interview, the Syrian army is the heart and soul in the fight against Islamist terrorists. And it is the Russian military that is allowing the Syrian army, or helping the Syrian army, to defeat ISIS and all the other terrorist groups. America and Britain, I emphasize, is not genuinely fighting terrorism.
Okay.
They are part of the problem.
OK, that's all we have time for this evening. But thank you so much for your time, Mr. Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First, speaking to us live from London there. Thank you again.